Today, as you can tell, we're going to talk about raising kids. Before I did Deep Thoughts, I did these about 1 hour audio essays, which I've since pulled. You can only get them through the podcast. And, I would typically write like an outline, and then I would read the outline as I was doing it, so it was a little more regimented than these Deep Thoughts. But one of the most popular ones I did was about raising kids. I got the most comments on it that were very positive. People saying it sort of improved their perspective. And since I pulled those, I want to go ahead and redo that particular one because I've obviously had more time to think about it. And I know what you're thinking, raising children is sort of this sanctified area of existence where we don't feel like anyone should be allowed to tell us how to raise our kids. And that's not what's going to happen in this presentation here. This is not me telling you how to raise your kids. This is me just telling you some ideas about maybe if you haven't thought about this particular idea, maybe this will work for you. But also kind of getting some perspective on the whole thing about raising kids, because let's face it, we don't get a brochure in the mail that says, oh, you're a parent now. Well, here's how you raise your kids. There's different cultures, different philosophies. But I think it's fairly safe to say that in this day and era, kids aren't getting raised that well anymore. The sheer success of children is one indication. The perseverance of children is another indication. The overall health of a child is an indication. And I just think we've lost our way. And I think that we're utterly confused about how to gain our way. And I think that it's not exactly anyone's fault. But what I find in the world is that a person who says, you're not going to tell me how to raise my kid, is usually the crappiest parent on planet Earth, who is merely projecting their inequities, their nervousness towards being graded as a parent. And we need to wipe that away. If you're that person, this is your home. This is going to be a really good video for you to sit back, relax. We're not having a real conversation here. I'm just presenting to you. But I feel you, and I know that you want to do well. And maybe you're doing 99% well, but the 1%'s kicking your ass. Could be, But let's study culture for a split second. Let's reverse, just like we always do on the show. There's an old saying, you don't know where you're going if you don't know where you've been. And that's sort of the theme of the first third of every one of these shows, which is we're going to talk about a subject. All right, well, let's back up. Let's back up and find how we even needed to get to this point where we needed to talk about a subject or wanted to talk about a subject. Regardless of how you believe the creation of man occurred, I think it's safe to say that there was an era of man that wasn't very sophisticated, that wasn't very civilized, and then through toil, through trial and error, through pain and suffering, we reached a point in our development, our protein development, that we managed to come up with some pretty good ideas about how to exist as a civilization. And the cornerstone of all civilizations are the children of that civilization. If you get one generation right and the next generation's completely screwed, then you don't have a civilization almost overnight. So, looking back, we know we've had wonderful eras of civilization and totally screwed up ones, and then ones that are half okay and half screwed up. We look back to the Egyptians and we notice an entire civilization that is just killing architecture, killing art. I mean, they're making it happen on a level that is remarkable, right? And then they became the haves. And you got your Mesopotamian wars, your Roman wars. You have people that want to take it away from them. And they eventually did. We know that in the last 150 years, you have a Civil War soldier writing a letter home to his parents, right? He had to be 18 to join the military at the time. A lot of kids snuck in, like my some of my relatives. And their vocabulary was so massive that it takes college professors today to translate it, just like a Shakespearean script. Where do these kids get their education? In barns and little church houses and little schools that are just built in tiny little communities. How many years did they go to school? Well, up to about 8th grade, and they came out. And their vocabularies were so tight at 8th grade that they were able to write letters home that we can barely translate today. Think about all the geniuses in the 1800s that invented or discovered all the electronics that we have today, how electricity works. Isaac Newton coming up with calculus. Well, he didn't have all these modern amenities, now did he? But the marketing departments of the world would make you think that without these modern things, you're not going to be smart. When these people didn't have any of that stuff, and they focused and they were smart. As kids, they were brought up in such a way that we would consider them utterly deprived human beings today. And yet they accomplished more in their tiny lifespans than the people in this world with every single faculty, every single resource. Now, what will end up happening is if I say to you, hey, I think the 1950s showed the most promise in the United States of America, someone will come in and say, oh, but this was wrong, but that was wrong, and you didn't live in that era. All right. I don't know too many restaurants in the world that are themed after the 90s, that are themed after the 70s, that are themed after the 60s. I know one that's themed after the 80s. Definitely none themed after the 21st century. Because that era was actually an amazing era of this country. And it was built on fantastic education, feeding a culture to make a country fantastic. And I don't know all the histories of European countries, but I know each European country also had their amazing era as well. Now, I don't know which decade for which country, but I'm sure every single one of you can look back in the bowels of your country and go, well, at that decade, it was just sweet as hell. And really, up to that decade, it just kept getting better and better until it reached that peak, that summit. Well, we want that today for every single country on planet Earth, and we'd love to use the internet to harmonize it all at the same exact time, gain a frequency of raising kids well so that we can all relax and realize that the world's going to turn out okay. Because there's a war on our kids today. There's a war on our kids to make sure they do turn out to be the most uneducated, unmotivated children on planet Earth that will be subservient to a system that has to rescue them. It's already happening. We have a socialist in America running for president. The only way a socialist can ever run for president and actually get on a ticket and get national press is that there's a band of people, which we have essentially 3 generations in play. We have your millennials, we have your Gen X, and we have your baby boomers. Your baby boomers and your millennials are exactly the same. Overcoddled generations or neglected generations that need a socialistic Mother Goose to take care of them because before, their parents took care of them, right? In the center, you have your mutt, you have your Gen Xer, who definitely is suffering from its own level of entitlement. But in the end, it's that this whole movement is being pushed by Gen Xers. Alex Jones is a Gen Xer. I guess I'm a Gen Xer. I'm like right on the tippy top of Gen Xer and baby boomer, right? Born in '69. But it all starts with our kids. Now, I said a couple episodes back that setting expectations is everything, right? A child is only upset if a child has bad expectations of life. A parent only feels like they're a failure when they measure their child's behavior and it's not working out. When the parent has to over-monitor the child just to get the basics of life to occur. The child, demands products or demands services that they shouldn't be demanding to stay satiated because they're bored. And the parent never says, hey, you need to take care of this by yourself. I'll clothe you, I'll feed you, I'll educate you. When it comes time to figure out what to do with your life, you need to play with these toys I gave you. Take that piece of paper and that pen and make it happen, right? The subject of parenting today is so complex because there are so many opposite forces trying to sabotage what you do. And unfortunately, we take it on ourselves as a personal failure if you have anything that goes wrong. Now, you will make mistakes, especially with your first child, in my opinion, because you've never done it before. And, all's well that ends well is sort of what I say. But today, you're not allowed to, or at least it's massively frowned upon to discipline your child physically, spank their butts. We're going to get into all this stuff. It's going to be a long episode. I'm going to just tell you that right now. But what I have discovered is that kids that were spanked properly, right? Not abused, not closed fists and beaten up and that kind of stuff. But a kid that was disciplined and spanked when they're little, and just, you don't need a bunch of those moments. You just need a few of those moments to really galvanize the child's trust and who's the boss, right? Kids aren't usually ashamed of that fact. In fact, they're actually pretty proud they got their butts kicked. It was sort of a rite of passage. They push the envelope, and the parents push back. And they tend to have more respect for their parent the more they did get disciplined. Up to a point, of course, right? What I haven't heard is a child say to me, or a buddy of mine say to me, well, my parent never spanked me, and I'm so proud. I think you can see a measurable difference in a human being that has been spanked versus a person who hasn't been spanked. There's a grip on reality. There's a grip on tenaciousness. And there's an utter respect for the system of how it works. And I believe that there is, quite frankly, when you look at the educational system, at least in America, with Common Core especially, but if you go back to Charlotte Iserbyt's gigantic book, The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America, you will see a cabal massively hatched in the early 70s where they were going to destroy the educational system and thus the entire family of America. Because, again, America's always been the massive threat. And I would say, again, if Europeans had their guns, they would be as equal of a threat. But because they don't have guns, they're immediately taken down a notch in the threat meter, right? The DEFCON meter of freedom. Now let's take the way it used to be. When America was great, you had a generation of kids that grew up in some of the most tumultuous situations on planet Earth. I would say that my grandparents were pretty much the last amazing generation to come through this country. My parents, they're in their generation, they're awesome people, and they're definitely exceptions to what I'm about to say in everything that I say here. But I think the overwhelming majority of your baby boomers were unintentionally overcoddled. It's not their fault, and it's really not the fault of my grandparents for trying to give my parents more resources than they had and all of the neighboring kids, But in my hometown, which again is about 10,000 people, I got to see who dealt with life well and who didn't deal with life well. The amount of parents from the kids my age, the people that I dated and the people that were my friends, who had to go to their parents for I would say up to 40% of all their survivable income throughout their entire adult life was phenomenal. Because they couldn't deal with life. They couldn't find the connection between getting up in the morning and working and making money enough to pay the bills. And so they constantly failed. I have relatives who've lived off the grandparents. And it's not that you don't ask for your parents for help from time to time. That might be something you do, but let's make it special. Let's not make it a means to an end, right? A means to an end. But in a little hometown, you wouldn't think there'd be a lot of money in my hometown. But I know 3 different families, I'll put my own in there as one of the 3, where individuals were getting checks of like $40,000, $50,000 every, quarter to half a year just to make ends meet. In the Midwest, that's a massive amount of money. That's several months' pay. This comes right out of the family savings, right into the bank account to make up so this 40-something, 50-something-year-old guy. I even know people that borrow money like that until their 60s. In my own family, when my grandmother passed away, she left, I'd say a fair amount of money to a couple of my relatives. I think about, we're talking about 30 grand or something like that to two of the sons. I don't know what one of the sons did with it, but I'm sure he put it in the bank and it's still earning interest to this day. But I know that one of the sons went and bought an entertainment center for his house, bought a bunch of bullshit electronics, literally blew through $27,000 in nothing flat, and still came away with credit card debt. And had probably $20,000 in credit card debt while he was spending this money. Instead of just paying off his credit cards and saying, I'm free at last, right? That's your baby boomer. That's the guy that's going to really love the concept of Obamacare, that they think it's free health insurance. They're going to love socialism because it's, again, mommy and daddy are dead now. There's no one to cut that check for them. So any promise, regardless of how ridiculous it is, or how much it's going to rape the future of the millennial kids, of their kids, right? They don't care. They're trying to steal from the future to pay for their present. And it's crazy. So we have to make sure that our kids don't turn out like this. We absolutely have to make sure. And the theme of this program is going to be some traditional techniques brought back that you may actually have to do some changing as a parent, but I guarantee you once it starts working, you're going to love it, right? And I'm going to give you some new techniques that I used on my daughter that just serendipitously happened. It was just a mistake. And it turned out to be one of the greatest mistakes ever to raise a child. Right. And I've dated people with children. I've helped raise their kids, and it just always works. It just completely works. So let's get into it. Thank you for making it through the intro there. You know, when I was a kid, I came home and my mom raised me until I was about 8 years old, and she went off and got a job. And again, back in the day, we didn't have babysitters. Your kid just got off the bus and walked in the house, had the little key around their neck or hidden somewhere in the house on the outside, and you use the key and you open the door. And I was completely by myself, raising myself. It was a blast. I felt trusted. I felt empowered. I felt like I had a good relationship with my parents. I felt like my parents treated me like a young adult, and they didn't worry about, there wasn't the paranoia that the internet creates today, and the internet wasn't creating sexual perverts out of everybody, right? That's one of the problems with the internet today, all this porn that goes around. You might be using it with you and your spouse to get off, or you by yourself or whatever, but it's also making the guy down the street who has never been with the sex he's attracted to, and he is just getting absolutely perverted to the point he grabs our kids, right? So the world's a little bit different, which is why you got to think twice about writing that blank check to what is, categorized as an immoral act. It's not like sex is a bad thing. It's just, I think that our ancestors learned how it does make sexual deviance that do hurt people. And so it started becoming this moral imperative to not have a bunch of pornography around, but we lost the reason why that happened, and so we don't talk about it. We just say, don't do drugs, don't do porn, and we don't mention, well, the problem is you might be able to control it, but your neighbor can't, and your little girl's going to be playing out front of that guy's house, and he's going to do something stupid. So in order to protect our kids, we have to protect the consciousness and the mental aptitude and lust factors in mankind and keep these things away from the adults, right? But I was raised by my mom for at least the first 8 years of my life. And then they had the feminist movement in the 70s, and the women were suckered by the Rockefeller organization, fueled by all these programs coming out of the European banking cartels to tell these families, one, they told all the women in the world that they were being persecuted. The amount of women that it's like they caught wife beating. They thought in their brains, well, I am being treated unfairly and I am being beaten up by my husband or whatever, and no one's touching anybody. But in their brain, they caught this psychosis of you're not free women, right? And so what happened? The rat race that men were trying to get out of, and men are always trying to get out of the rat race. Everybody wants to win the $1 billion lottery ticket. Everybody wants to get out, make that invention and sell it and make a bunch of money and relax, right? Everybody wants their destiny to be something different than what they are if they haven't really, massaged it their entire life. Well, women were fighting to get into that frickin' rat race when, with a traditional style of raising kids in the 70s, you had kids in your late teens, early 20s. And, hey, like me, when I was 8 years old, I was still in, second grade? And second or third grade or whatever, my mom went off and became a bank teller. Eventually, she went all the way up to work for the Federal Reserve of all companies for 20 years. Right? She got her dream without any problems. Now, if she had 2 kids or 3 kids, it would have delayed it a little bit, but she still would have gone on the same journey. And hell, I would have been raising my younger brothers and sisters, personally. Probably would have dug it, right? So it wasn't like women didn't have destinies. My grandmother was a teacher for 36 years and had 2 sons. Hey, my grandfather never beat her. I think they may have argued a few times in their entire marriage. But the way that they portrayed it in the 70s was that everyone was being repressed. Suffrage, right? Now, women needed the right to vote, but also women needed to get educated on what the issues were. And we were pretty much keeping women down out of everything. So they combined a little bit of truth about repression, and then they put a bunch of fiction in there. They put a couple of the 1%ers that were getting beat up by their husbands, and they tried to convince the whole population that this was happening, that they need to get free. What did that do? That took mothers away from children months after being born. And that's the way it is today. It used to be the dad could go to work and have a single income, bring it home, and pay for the mortgage of the house, pay for all the car loans, and pay for all the food, shelter, and entertainment, right? Now it became a 2-income household. You can't have that house, a car, and the bare minimums of life, the strategic resources of life, unless both man and woman work. As it's been said many times on the internet, what that did was that put the child into the system very, very quickly. There's a family way to all families. And you might think, well, even if your kid goes to daycare, goes to school, they still come home at night and eat dinner with the family and hang out on the weekends. And that's enough time to tell my kid how to behave. Hey, if you actively engage that sentiment, you might be right. But the amount you could give your child at the formative years of their life will be way more intense if you spend every moment with them. If nothing else, we know the transfer of information happens when 2 humans get in proximity with each other. This has been proven a million times with what they call the 10 monkey experiment. I haven't covered this in a million years. I'm not sure I've ever covered it on Deep Thoughts, so let me tell you how it works. It was actually done with 100 monkeys. It's been done multiple times, but they call it the 10 monkey experiment. And they have a huge environmental agrodome where they have a bunch of monkeys and a whole habitat inside there. And they take a monkey out and they put it in a laboratory room and they give it a machine. And if it can actually complete the use of this machine, it gets a food pellet and it gets put back out into the wild with its friends. But the first monkey that goes in takes about 2 weeks to figure out how to do it, even though every single day, multiple times a day, they show the monkey how to do it. It just takes a while for the monkey to get the mechanical, get the conceptual understanding of that it's supposed to finish this to exit, but 2, to build up the motor skills in the brain to do the trick. Now, they take that monkey and they put it back in the environment, and they watch where it exists. And usually, even if you did 100 monkeys, you have a group of monkeys that are going to stay in a clique, another group of monkeys stay in another clique, and they don't really interact with each other. Just a natural divide. They take a monkey out of a different group, and they put it in that room, and they give it the same test. And all of a sudden, that monkey's a little bit faster. They put that monkey back in the environment. They take another one out that didn't interact with the other 2, and they put it in there and touches the machine. And now it's really fast. Until within 10 monkeys, they have 100% accuracy. They take a monkey out, put him in there, immediately does the machine, comes right back out. Minutes, seconds. And it proved that these creatures actually transfer information due to proximity. And those of you who have raised children, you'll know that the more time you get to spend with your children, the more your child becomes like you, the more the family way and the family knowledge and the family behavior, the family maturity, the family skill sets all bleed into your child, because your proximity of your brain to their brain, your consciousness to their consciousness, something happens, something transfers between the two. For those of you who've ever learned a guitar with a great guitar player, I've been privileged to be in this situation. You'll sit next to someone. Now, some people are horrible educators, and those people aren't going to really help you out that much, but there is something wild that happens when someone's a teacher, which means they're sort of exuding this frequency of knowledge, right? That's what a teacher does. And you suddenly learn a new riff really, really fast, very, very accurately. And the entire time you're in the presence of this person, everything that you're learning goes a hell of a lot faster. Your soloing technique goes great. You make a mistake, they say, "Oh, I know what you're doing. You're not resting your hand on your strings in your electric guitar, so it's weighing it out too much. You're not pushing on the fret properly. You're not doing this properly." Now, you go home with your guitar and you wake up the next day and you're like, "I want to practice because the yesterday was fantastic with my teacher." And all of a sudden it becomes twice as difficult, or measurably more difficult when you're completely by yourself, because you don't have that aura of knowledge popping out of their brain, going in your brain, aligning your neural net with their neural net, your consciousness with their consciousness. So getting children away from parents has a much more profound effect than just the physical separation of the two. Now, you also don't want kids that can't leave their parents, right? Every kid blubbers on their first day to school, and then you can't get them out of the frickin' school by the end of the day, right? Because they love being with their friends. But we need to take it very, very seriously, the intent to have our kids taken away from us. When my kid was born, I was not aware of any of this stuff. Now, I might say that to you, and you're like, "Damn it, I totally agree with you, but I'm stuck in that two-income household, and I can't really do what you're saying, but I totally believe in it." Don't worry. Don't worry. All that means is if you're an aware parent, well, if you're watching this and you're curious, right? You made it past the entire concept of someone telling you some techniques of parenting. Hats off to you. Even if this is bad information, your courage to listen to someone else lament is admirable, right? Just know that when you do have access to your kids, that you probably want to turn up the heat a little bit. Have more fun with them. Interact with them a little bit more. We're going to get into all these techniques in just a second here. But we have to understand that where we are today was not our choice. Just like we don't choose any of the power supplies, but we're blamed for them, and we're taxed to build new power plants, and then we give the power plants off to these elite families to then charge us money for them, right? Our families have been dismantled from their, I would say, the best configurations to make successful children. Because once you have an unsuccessful child, you have a child that's on the dole of the government. They have to get everything from the government. These socialistic programs can control them, right? Now, the other thing that happened in the me factor of the 70s, this feminist, women's movement, I should say, was that it thrust in film and television. There was a massive epidemic of how men were forcing women down. Even if this wasn't occurring in the real world, that's what people started to believe. And that me factor theme that was in so much of the writing caused divorce to explode. Because the new regiment of the 70s and the 80s was that if anything goes wrong in the family, divorce should be the first word that comes on the tip of your tongue. Break the family in half, because, man, you're not going to have anybody tell you what to do. All right. One of the big things they said in the 70s was that women would go their whole lives without having credit cards, without having anything in their name. And so if the husband divorced them for a trophy wife, the wife was sitting there with no credit, no money, and there was always this doomsday thing. Well, now most states engage in community property, right? So that when you get married, 50% of everything your husband gets, the woman gets as well, even if she sits at home and raises children. Just 50% down the line. Now, whatever you bring into the marriage, at least in California, is what you get to keep. So if you brought $1 million in and you only earned $100,000, well, the wife is only on the hook for the 50, But now that system has been heavily, heavily abused. It is in the best interest of at least one of the partners not to work, because in the end, they're going to get half of what the other person has. I'll just give you a little digression about how bad that went for one of my buddies. One of my buddies had his parents married until their mid-50s. The wife started buying into this idea that she was persecuted. And I know the mom and I know the dad, and they're both sweet people. This was just a temporary moment of insanity. The father was one of the sweetest guys on planet Earth. Doesn't mean they were compatible, and doesn't mean they should have stayed together. I have no right to say either way. But the mom met a guy who was a charlatan, a con man, and he smoothed the mother over while she was married. She fell in love with this guy. He convinced her to get divorced. She gets divorced. In getting divorced, she had community property, and because she was a stay-at-home mom, she liquidated 50% of the family wealth, including her husband's pension, because he was a teacher. He's still a teacher today because his pension isn't deep enough to help him retire. So she got, 150 grand or something like that out of the marriage. Just ripped this guy's heart out. Gives it to the charlatan. The charlatan spends every dime and disappears. Awesome, right? That's where that can go when you buy into these ideas of the fact that you're suffering. And maybe it's up to you to put something in instead of just taking something out, right? Again, I know both these people, and I know the mom really well, and she's a sweetheart too. She just, again, lost her mind. So when a parent decides to get divorced, I need to cover this because it affects the children. Obviously, it's a traumatic thing for the kids, depending on how old the kids are, and depending on the individual maturity of the children. But once the child's broken apart, the income structure, unless one of the parents is extremely wealthy and can make it ubiquitous, make money and resources, just no problem, right, with their extra cash. The court systems have rigged everything to bleed the dad dry, so he barely has enough money to pay his bills. And the mom may or may not need to work based on how much she can drain out of the other guy. But because women want to work, they still leave the house, and the kids are just sort of like without mom and dad. And they see a lot of turmoil and anger between the two of them, right? So divorce, as everybody knows, is a big deal. But I think it's exacerbated by programming from the folks that Charlotte Iserby talked about. Now, Charlotte Iserby, just to mention her for a split second, I believe Kyle told me that her father was a Skull and Bones guy, which is the Yale University sort of secret society. It's not Yale University's fault. These people happen to set up shop in their university, but, they run the world in a big, big way, or they're the agents of those who run the world. And they're the ones that brought this Prussian education system in, where we shut off the right brain, make the left brain the dominant race, and that reduces a lot of happiness. They're the ones that also control Hollywood, where it counts, I should say. So I mention all this foundational stuff because we need to understand how we as parents may have been duped. Maybe if you're a Gen Xer, you may have suffered from these divorces. My parents divorced, and I can definitely tell you it. In my particular case, one, it didn't affect me much. I thought it was actually kind of cool. And because I got to see my dad in his world, and we could be dudes together and break all the rules. And my mom, was the one trying to make me a man. My dad was making me a man, but my mom was trying to get me to behave in front of, people. My dad was really good around that too. But my dad just was like, if it was just us dudes, we could do almost anything we want to do. But if the women show up, you got to be a good guy. Right? You can't swear. You can't talk about inappropriate things. And he was really good about that. But my parents divorced because my father got stuck in sort of he fell victim to, I think, consumption and not chemicals but things, purchasing things, right? And it just got to a point where my mom just kept telling him, look, man, you got to slow down because we don't make this much money, And so they divorced. But they also remained friends. My parents they still were intimate after the divorce. It was kind of cool. So for me, it was like, okay, you guys are friends. I get it. You just can't live together. That's cool. Well, Dad lives down the street. That's awesome. Eventually, my dad had moved to Massachusetts. I followed him. But then we came back to the Midwest and Had all my old friends and my family right in my backyard, right? But my dad struggled. The 80s were sort of even though they were a great era, they were definitely tough for the economy of the Midwest. But I learned a bunch of stuff living in a tiny town that I want to share with you. Because tiny towns, again, they just have this amazing overview of life that you don't get from the big city. And what's weird is when I lived in a small town, I always thought that the big city kids always had everything and I had nothing. And what I learned was it was the complete inverse. I had everything. I lived in a little Twilight Zone town. My hometown looks just like Walt Disney's hometown in Missouri. His hometown was built in the 1800s, so was mine. His hometown was a railroad town, so was mine. With 10,000 people, that sounds like a lot of people, but I guarantee you'll know thousands of them personally. Personally. Even if you don't know them, you will have heard a story about how the family went, whether or not they did well or they didn't do well. You'll go to school and you'll go to school with the kids, and some of their parents are the teachers or they're the faculty that help run the facilities, and you get to see favoritism, or you get to see a parent being tough on their kids because they want their kids to grow up to be great kids, great adults, right? And being a kid, I will say that the one thing that definitely I got out of being a divorced, a son of a divorced family was that, like most kids, you don't want to get divorced yourself. Even if it doesn't traumatize you that much, you're just sort of like, well, I don't want to have that happen to me. And so I started paying attention to couples. I started paying attention to families that were really successful. And a lot of times, what I saw in my little hometown was that a family would be successful for an era, and they would be unsuccessful for a different era. And some will be successful all the way through. So the whole time I'm paying attention. And then I would get really close and embedded with these families, and you start to see sort of the fact that even the ones that got it right, it was hard work. And I would interview these couples. I'd interview the parents and say, man, you guys look like you're a fabulous couple. How do you do it? And they look at me, they look at each other, and they look at me, and they go, well, kid, it's hard work. It looks good on the outside, but we're compromising all the time, and it's not always. I think one of the coolest couples that was actually shocked. I think I was probably about 18, 19 years old, and I asked him this question, and I got the sense that they were impressed that anybody would ask them the question, And they looked at each other, and they in front of each other, right? I think the husband said, and I can only think that they had said this to each other and rehearsed this line. Or they had been told this piece of wisdom and they passed to me, which was the following. They said, we don't always wake up in love with each other, but we know that we've chosen each other. And we know that in time, even if we've lost this bubbling, overt love for each other, we'll get it back. It comes back. It ebbs and it flows, and that's life. But they said every time it comes back, you feel a sense of pride that you made it through that tough time. And I can tell you in my own experience, it's not only that, but you'll actually, one of the most dangerous things that can happen in a relationship or marriage is that the couple gets out of phase with each other within that paradigm, which is, the husband will be totally head over heels for the wife, and the wife will be sort of on the downbeat. She won't feel that utter love for her husband. And then it flips. She's totally in the I love my husband, and the husband's maybe even feeling a little abused because he didn't get the attention when he was on his up, and so he goes down. And when those biorhythms of appreciation get out of phase with each other, my advice is you two have to find a place to go where you can focus on each other. And maybe you have to get the kids off to the grandparents. If you don't have that option, take them with you, but try to work it out such that you two have time for each other. Because without a husband and a wife, even if it's, you're raising someone else's children, but that's the family unit, you two have to be in tune with each other. And it might take more than one try. Maybe you need a couple vacations within a single year. But it's better that you spend all your money, quite frankly, in my opinion, getting back on track with each other than to get divorced and suffer the slings and arrows of the financial ruin that causes, right? And the hardship to your children, the hardship to your own souls. Because in the end, you probably do want to love each other again, like you did when you first met. Now, all of us have seen kids in the public that are just horribly behaved. And we look at those parents and we're like, God damn, what's wrong with you, right? So I'm just going to start arbitrarily hacking the tree down of raising a child. It's probably a horrible metaphor, but next to children. But there is, it's sort of an accomplishment. I always think of, I use tree cutting in my own brain as a metaphor for big projects that I get into. Because I'll get into projects that take 4 years, 5 years to complete. Making a video game for that long with a really shoestring budget with a really small group of people. Or I'm personally building something that's massive at home, some software tool or something, even a painting. And it just takes a long time to make it happen because I don't have dedicated time to give to it. So I have to come back to it, my round robin of things I'm doing, and give a certain number of days in a week. And I may not see it for a month and come back. Script writing is the same exact thing, right? So I always say what I used to tell myself in my 20s. I used to tell my friends, I say, yeah, I'm chopping the redwood down with a hatchet. All right? Redwoods that are sometimes as big around as your house. They can cut holes in them so you can drive trucks through them. They're so gigantic, and they still stand up 1,000 feet in the sky. But you will get it chopped down, even with a tiny little hatchet. And you could probably get it down with a bread knife, as long as the bread knife did disappear in the chopping process, right? But you can get anything down by keeping at it. And raising a child is sort of that sort of analogy, you know, where you're going to have a string of things that are going to have to be done because they just are mandated by the child's existence, and you have to be prepared for it, right? Now, if you want children and you have children, that's the easiest path you can take. It's not that they won't kick your ass still, right? Because especially if you've never raised one, you don't really know what you're getting into. Now, for those of you who had brothers and sisters and you saw the ecosystem of raising a child, you're way ahead of me. But the one thing I try to tell folks, and I got this off somebody else, but I thought it's always worked out, which is if you're not prepared to give up your entire life for your child, within certain areas, certain regions, you still need to be, you know, you have self, family, and work. You still need to keep self and work in line, right? Because your child needs your resources as well. They need your happiness and they need your resources, right? Because you're providing. But when you do have that family time, it's got to be dedicated. And you have to find it as a reward in life to have a child, in my opinion. Now, some of you end up having children without trying. Something happens. I think it's weird how people, and hopefully we can just put this to bed right now. For any of you who are quote unquote a mistake, right? My cousin was a mistake, and it bothered him his whole life that he was a mistake. I remember him driving home from junior high. I was an 8th grader. He was a 9th grader. And he had learned he was a mistake, I think, from an aunt, or maybe even from our grandmother or whatever. And it bothered him that he wasn't meant to be. And I've recently had conversations with people that make excuses about, well, I wasn't meant to be. And I always tell people, it's like, I'm willing to bet 50% of the world wasn't meant to be. It just happened. And there's nothing wrong with that at all, folks. You know, you may have a parent that resented you because you were a mistake. That's their problem. It's not your problem. You exist. And you're not unique if you're a mistake. You're just like everybody else, right? And, you know, the idea is that if you were meant to be, that suddenly everything gets better. You have better parents, and they're better at being parents, and da-da-da. It's like, well, maybe. But you've seen kooky-ass parents that are just way, way too much into parenting. Like they can't get out of parenting. The JonBenet Ramseys of the world that are made out of parents that are psychotics, right? Daddy's a sexual perv, and mom's trying to live her a beauty queen lifestyle through a child, dressing her infant child up as a sexy little girl. You know, that's what made daddy go to, Amsterdam and dress up whores like his daughter. This scumbag would buy dresses that look just like his daughter's dresses in competition and say, wear this so I can have sex with you. That kid was utterly and completely murdered by her family and some friends, we think. So that's a parent that wanted their child, right? So it's just as equal as being a mistake as being meant to be. So let's just put that to bed. If you're a mistake, don't think anything bad about yourself, for God's sakes. And if your child was a mistake, don't feel bad. It's just the way it happens every once in a while, right? Okay. Now, when you see a child that's misbehaving, the one that I always notice is when I go to restaurants. So a few things you notice at restaurants. One, the restaurant becomes a playground for the child. It's not a place to eat and be respectful towards others. It's a place to unleash your child to run around and be crazy. Now, if you take them to a Chuck E. Cheese, that's what that place is supposed to be. If you take them to any recreational themed restaurant, that's sort of what they're begging you to do, is bring your child there and lose them in the arcade with a roll of quarters or whatever the hell it is that makes the place take over, right? But most restaurants aren't like that. Most restaurants, your kid's supposed to sit down, behave, not be too loud, and eat and enjoy themselves and go home, right? What I learned about that when I was pining to have my own child was a few things. You can either raise your child from the moment they're born, or you can do what some parents do, and you essentially don't engage your child until they become a bad behaving child. When you wait, you've screwed your kid up. Because the child has been taught that anything goes up to the point where you try to become a disciplinary parent. Your child is also invested in bad behavior. They have typically been engaging in bad behavior for a lot longer than they've been doing good things, right? The kid's 3 years old and has never been disciplined. Well, they've had 3 out of 3 years doing anything that they want. And you can't just turn it on real easily and have any success, right? Now, I'm going to give you some techniques to get them out of that by engaging them in a rite of passage conversation. And the show Walking Dead has in fact, I'll just go into it so I don't forget. In the 6th season of Walking Dead, there's a situation with this little boy who is just a meek little child. It's different than the little girl who was in a previous season who was also having terrible problems dealing with an apocalypse, and no one can blame a child for not dealing with the zombies walking around outside really horribly. But this is a metaphor for what actually happens in real life, right? This little boy gets to a point where they have to move from point A to point B, and the kid's been sort of hiding in his upstairs bedroom, and the mother allowed it, thinking, well, he just needs to get over this problem in his own way, in his own pace. And the problem with that, letting a child who has no framework or no perspective of life to determine the rules by which they raise themselves at such a young age, it almost ensures that child will fail. In this particular case, the metaphor and what was at stake is so high, which is not only his life will be lost, but if he gets himself in a bad situation and someone tries to save him in this post-apocalyptic zombie world, that he could get everyone else killed as well. And in fact, the last show I saw, there's a cliffhanger where the kid is about to do just that. He's breaking some serious rules with this world, and they've told him not to break these rules, like one, making noise, and he's losing his cool, and he's talking while they're walking through a band of zombies, right? They figured out a way to get through a band of zombies by covering themselves in the innards of these zombies to make them smell just like the zombies, and the kid's running his mouth because he can't deal. And no one sat the kid down and said, this is the moment in your life where you need to man up. This is where you become a young man. And every kid wants to grow up, right? Every little boy wants to shave as fast as he possibly can, grow a mustache as fast as he can. Everybody wants to grow up. The girls have their own things that they want to do. They want to grow up and be mature. They want to be part of the adults. They want to have more control. They want to control the exploration of their world. And instead of flipping this insecurity as a positive for the kid, of course, they're writing this so that they can have a good piece of drama in this fictional thing. But I see this happen all the time in real life. And if you've neglected your kid on accident and they're sort of out of control, you can engage their most inner desires to grow up and mirror that with behavior that you need out of your child and say, this is the way you get to become a grown-up. And you're ahead of all the other kids because I can tell you really want to control your world. And let's talk about it. Let's set down some ground rules where you can grow up faster than the other kids if that's what you want to do, you know. But my recommendation is not to wait. If you're so privileged to do so, if you haven't had your kids yet, or your kids are still crying in a crib, my recommendation is to, you know, give them soft corrections. With my kid, it was just constantly telling her what was good and what was bad, what was allowed, what wasn't allowed, in a very soft tone. And so when she looked at something, like a power outlet in the wall, we used to say, we used to take her over to the power outlet and we'd say, no touch, right? No touch. And she had no idea what electricity was. She had no idea what being shocked felt like, but she dug it. She learned a little rule for her brain. It's the left side of her brain gets this. And what was cute was everybody who came over the house, she would take them by the hand, bring them over to a outlet, and she'd go, no touch, no touch. She's passing the rule down, right? And that let her be a little adult in her own mind. And I'm not sure how she perceived that, but that she was sort of into behaving because it was her authority on her own life, and it gave her more control. And obviously, because she never got in trouble, she had a lot of privileges because she was always a good kid. Because we started raising her from the moment she was born, as opposed to waiting until these other events took place, right? I'm going to go through, because this is a really long cigar, I'm going to go through, you know, I would say 10 and under things, 10 and over, 10 to 20 things, and 20 and up, right? And again, I know if you start feeling like this, if you're normal, I would say you have almost a sense of rejection for anyone telling you this kind of stuff. But remember, we're all by ourselves raising these kids. And some of you have great families that you know this, and you could give me advice. Every one of you could give me advice to do this better, right? Please know that I understand that. I respect that in you. But some folks have nothing. Their families they're estranged from their families for some reason. Some people lose their families because perhaps they passed away by accident or just by sheer age. Who knows, right? So we have to work together as a community to sort of pass information back and forth. We don't have forums where we get together and routinely ask, well, you know, how's your kid behaving? Well, you know, da-da-da. And, you know, usually you see moms get together all the time and talk about how their kids are screw-ups. And they sort of laugh off the tragedy of raising children as opposed to engaging in maybe potentially solutions, right? So that's what I'm trying to do, is just share with you some successes I had just in case they help you. And hopefully the comments can fill up with all kinds of other great suggestions, right? Again, if I said, where's the formal location where you learn how to raise children, crickets would start chirping before there would ever be a decent answer, right? Unless you have a great circle around you, right? Now, one thing that I see is the inverse problem, where a child is overcoddled by their parents to the extent that they can't behave, they don't know how to behave by themselves, and they're very, very insecure and codependent. Now, I've seen codependency formed out of both formulas, and I'm not sure exactly. I'll tell you what I did to hopefully kill the codependency in my own kid. You could have a parent that is always with their child, always touching their child, always coddling their child, and the child then grows up thinking, I need Mother Goose, I need that around me constantly. And then you have the parent that completely neglects their child, and they create codependency because the child always wanted that companionship. So what I did with my daughter was essentially say, look, there's time where we're going to sit down on the sofa, watch movies, go see movies, go eat dinners, have all these crazy, beautiful conversations with each other. And then there's going to be time when we come home and you're going to go off to your bedroom and you're going to do what you do, or you go wherever in the house you want to be. And Dad's going to do his thing. You're going to actually watch your father exist in his own paradigm. And you're always invited into that paradigm to figure out what Dad's doing. You know, for those of you who watched the old show Brady Bunch back in the day, Dad, I think, was an architect. And you would see him at his, his drafting table, putting together ideas. And every once in a while, they'd run the script up to the point of like, well, what are you pitching? And he'd go, I'm doing this and this new thing. And so the kids got to see their father function at home in his home office. And then they spent the time with their mom and the maid and each other, all disciplining each other and kind of, harmonizing everybody into a, hopefully, it's a fictitious family, but there's definitely some decent lessons in that, right? But the other thing I've noticed is very basically the sleep regimen is huge for a child. The thing that always gets me is when I see a kid, I go to a restaurant, say at 9 o'clock at night, and I see a really young child being brought in with their parents at 9 o'clock at night. And I know you want to be the hip parent that gets your kid out there and, I'm gonna live my life with my kid like crazy. And I'm always going to take my kid with me, or I want to go out to eat and there's no babysitter, so I have to take my kid with me. That sort of regiment, again, it's really a sign that the parent has put themselves in front of their child. Every single parent I've talked to who have kids that are very successful in life, very mentally successful and potentially a career successful. The kids woke up at a particular time and went to bed at a particular time, and it was the same time almost every day. This changes a little bit. When my kid was really young, she'd wake up 6 or 7 in the morning. And Dad was not a 6 or 7 in the morning kind of guy, but I'd have to get up with her. And she'd go to bed at 6 or 7 at night. And so as long as I got to bed around 11 or 12, I had enough sleep for the next day, right? The child usually cries for 3 reasons. They're tired, they're hungry, or they're bored. I don't know. I mean, obviously pain could be one thing if they're sick. But knowing the difference between those cries is huge in the management of a child. A hunger cry goes on for quite a while until they get fed. The tired cry is always usually coupled with rubbing of the eyes, right? When your child starts rubbing of their eyes. And what's interesting is the more your child is really interested in being alive, they want to stay awake. Try to put your kid down, try to give them a bedtime as they get a little older and more sentient. They fight you in going to bed. I got some tricks for that too. But I want you to see that as a success, that your child's engaging life and loves being alive. But you obviously know if they don't get to bed and they become really tired the next day, then the whole next day is just a painful experience of them being tired throughout the day. Not being tired enough to go to bed, but tired enough to be grumpy. And before they can really form a sentence, it can be very frustrating as a parent. What I learned very quickly is my daughter had a 12-hour window awake and a 12-hour window asleep. And so when I needed to pick her up from school and go shopping for food and get her home and fix the food and get her to bed, I realized that if she was a 6 to 6 kid most of the time, a little 7 to 7 after a little while, but I realized that if I took her to the grocery store at 6, I was asking for it, and I got it a couple times, but I understood what the issue was. One of the things I did with my kid to pacify her at the grocery store, which was kind of funny, even when she was really tired and wanted to cry, at the time, they used to have these little coupon dispensers in the aisles, and you could just, this is before, all the coupons just happen with your little card. And we used to make a game out of this whole thing where the coupon dispensers were these little machines, and you pull a coupon out. It always had a little coupon sticking out. You pull it out, and another one would come out. And so I'd have her go down, and we'd just pick these coupons out of the thing to kind of pacify her. The other one is to get her one of her little tiny little toys that she likes and put it in the cart with her, and she could kind of play with that. But I always engaged my child with what was in the aisle because I realized that I could distract her with things that she was interested in and sort of buy myself some time, buy myself 20 minutes in the grocery store where she would normally be crying, and it worked. I actually got her to stop crying, right? Now, the other one is, before this all occurs, is how to establish that sleep behavior. And you have 2 types of parents. You have the parent that can never let their child cry. So when they're in their room or in the crib in your room, they're crying, and the parent always goes and grabs the child and holds it and puts it back down. And that goes forever. Now, you want to do that for at least 6 months because the child can die. So a lot of the SIDS could be related to neglect, And, of course, the way they sleep in their little bed, they could get a CO2 pocket with a blanket or something, or sleep on their stomachs, and it just cuts short their breath enough that they pass away. Got to make sure that doesn't happen, right? But my dad had a pretty good regiment that was, and I'll talk about some of the abandonment issues they talk about in psychology, which I think are real. I guess I cried for probably the first couple days. And my mom always wanted to come in and comfort me. And my dad finally said to her, stop going in there. Just let him cry. He needs to learn that this is going to help him. He's been fed. He's tired. And it's his time to sleep. For sure, it's his time to sleep. And, this is past the infancy stage. We have to feed a baby every 4 to 6 hours, or otherwise they're going to die. I was past that stage. So I'm not exactly sure exactly what age I was when that happened, but it must have been pretty early. Now, there's psychologists and psychiatrists that say that promotes a level of abandonment in the child. I think divorce creates more abandonment issues than anything else, but I think that there's probably some truth to that. I don't know who doesn't have at least a smidgen of abandonment issues in this day and age, right? Because families don't stay together. And eventually people do move away, and eventually people do die. And when that starts occurring, well, you can't keep everything forever. You can't keep a toy forever. You can't keep your favorite jeans forever. You can't keep your favorite teddy bear forever. So there's a lot of issues that contribute to abandonment way beyond creating a sleep regimen for your child. I was very fortunate. My moment with my daughter to get her to have a sleep regimen was probably one of the saddest interactions I had with my kid. I was sleeping in the same room with her, and we had a crib set up for her. And her mom and I were still together. We never married, but we were together physically to make sure that she saw us together all the time, because we prioritized her over ourselves, right? And there was a moment where she kept getting up, and she was happy. She was like getting up, going back down. She needed to be in bed by 7, and she was up around 8 or 9, kept getting up and laughing. And finally I got her up, and I gave her a big hug, and I told her I loved her, and she could see my eyes, and I could see her. And I laid her down on the bed, and I kept my hand on her chest. And she tried to get up, and my hand kept her down. And I told her I loved her. But the second I kept her from getting up, I saw my daughter's tears well up in her eyes. And she was like, why aren't you letting me up? And what's really weird about my heart just broke immediately. I was like, oh my God, I hate this. I hate having to discipline my kid like this. But it's for the greater good of her. And guess what? She never got up again after she went to bed. And she ended up having a great sleep regimen. Ended up being a super duper happy kid. When she was awake. And when she went to bed, she went to bed. Now, as she got older and more intelligent, she wanted to do more things, so she didn't want to go to bed. And obviously, you can flex. Obviously, they can stay up longer and longer as they get older, and they get to like an 8-hour sleep arrangement, so you can saw off like 4 hours of their sleep regimen over time, right? But one of the things I did, now let's say that you are afraid of telling your kid what to do. I have one of my dad's best friends. He told my dad once, he goes, because his kids were having a problem behaving. They're fine today, but he said, I work a really long day and I come home, and he goes, last thing I'm going to do is come in the house, having not seen my kids for 8 hours, and be the jerk that only disciplines them all the time, and I'm just the jerk, while mom gets to stay home and be the hero. And he didn't have anything against his wife. He just realized that was what he was perceived as being. And so my dad was kind of going, well, someone's got to put down the law in this house, because we go to your house and your kids are just crazy. Like, nobody wants to visit you because your kids are rambunctious and screaming and yelling, and they seem to have no behavior, right? Now, I'm going to tell you a trick. This is coming from a little town and from your humble narrator. And I'm sorry, this is an hour into the show. Kids don't like being told what to do, right? Because it removes their freedom. The kids also want to grow up. So there's a technique of flipping the script on their little brains, and they'll love it. They'll love rules. Again, you don't want to overrule your kid, because you can make them left brain crazies. And I'll tell you an example about that after I give you this trick. The trick is the following. In the Midwest, we tend to raise our kids to raise their own kids. What does that mean? Well, we take our children and we say, let's say your child's doing something that they shouldn't do. And what you really want to do is just say, hey, child, please stop doing this. It's for your greater good. But the child doesn't understand that concept, and you don't want to be the big naysayer like my dad's buddy. So what you do is you say to your child, this is what we do in the Midwest more often than not. We say, well, when you have kids, you're going to want to make sure that they don't do this. All of a sudden, the child goes, oh, yeah, I am going to have children, and I am going to be a big grown-up adult, and I'm going to make sure my kids don't do that. And then they stop doing it themselves. And they stop doing it because they are now the authority. They are now the parent. Even without their own children, they have been empowered, right? I don't use that word very often, but this is a good use for it. They're empowered to make the change on behalf of their unborn child. And they self-discipline, because that's a technique that you give them the authority to impose that on their own child. And they do it to themselves. It's amazing. So no longer are you the big naysayer, and no longer are you pointing the conversation directly at your child. You are obviously making little adults out of them. One little rule at a time. Now again, you don't want to get crazy. I'm going to tell you an example about a person I dated who was really, really affected by a very disciplinary parent, and it affected her to this day. It's really sad. I dated someone who was very heavily disciplined by her mom. And mom liked to keep a clean household. Mom had some kids with a different husband before meeting her, my girlfriend's father. So she had 3 kids. And then when she remarried, she had twins automatically. And I think we all agree, as the kids, these adults of the family, we agreed that what was happening was that the mom didn't want the father to feel like you have honored us with being able to raise these 3 other kids and the 2 that you just had. And she's going to basically make sure that the children don't cause friction in the family to make the father want to leave because the other fathers had. Of no fault to this woman whatsoever. So she over-disciplined the kids about keeping the house clean to an extent that their life was about cleaning the house. Barbarically so. You're like, what are you talking about? I'll give an example. At one point, the daughter forgot to dry off the inside of a shower. So they took a shower, and it's all wet inside. Instead of, most of us hop out and we let it dry, unless you have a glass partition there. You might want to squeegee it down or whatever. But most of us do not take a towel back into the shower and wipe down the walls and dry everything off to make sure no mold happens. It's a great idea. I wasn't raised like that. I sort of think I might want to get into that idea, but I don't know where you put the mountain of towels that make this happen, or have the time to do it, right? Probably I'll have the time to do it, but I don't know. I've never tried it. But when she forgot to do that one time, the punishment was you can't take a shower for 2 weeks. It's crazy, right? So this girl had to go to her friend's house secretly and bathe before she went to school. That upbringing made this kid so utterly left brain that everything in life that is left brain became her life. Her creativity, utterly zero. Because the only way that she could survive in her own family for a really long time, and I don't think the brothers and sisters actually suffered from this, but whatever, the youngest one's got this crazy upbringing, right? It was that she had to follow these rules, and it mentally impaired her for the rest of her life. She's a by-the-book, rule-mongering person. And it became an issue between the two of us, and that there was a closed mind that kept thinking it was opened. Consequently, she's one of the people that I told I took LSD with, and she literally almost shit herself. It was just like, oh my God, I've heard all these things about LSD, and you're just a horrible person for having taken it. Don't even tell me that you've taken it. I'm like, well, have you taken it? No, of course not. I saw all these things on TV and movies about how horrible it is, and drugs are bad, okay? Consequently, nothing else in life occurred to her that was left was right-brained, an open mind that would take in truth. It's really, really tough. And it wasn't her fault. It just happened to her, So that's why I say there are limits to how much you want to impose on your child. You want to give them the bare minimums of survival, right? So the little trick of flipping the script on your kid is one of the first gems you'll ever have. Now the next thing up is about getting your kid to sleep and sort of preparing them for life and sort of answering some questions for them, right? I put a whiteboard in my daughter's bedroom. when she was young, just so she could draw on it and hopefully keep illustrations off the sofa and the walls, right? And so, it became a little art board for a little while. My kid would draw these great big, pieces of art, and we'd take pictures of them and erase and keep going. But one time she needed to go to bed, and she was just wound up. I could just tell she was not ready for bed, but she needed to get to bed. We'd already let her go a certain amount of hours past her normal bedtime. It's a weekend. And I said, okay, let's do something here. I said, hop on your bed. She hops on her bed, and I say, okay, we're going to do a little game here. I said, I'm going to tell you about something in the world, and then you can ask me a question, and I'll tell you about that thing. So one, I'm going to teach you something that I want to teach you, and then the second half of this, you're going to pick something, and I'll explain it to you as much as you want to hear it. This got really cool. First lesson I ever taught her was about gravity. I thought, man, if my kid could understand gravity at 9, even the concept of it, and I wasn't aware of what I'm aware of today about it, but I started teaching her about mass pulling against mass, that sort of thing, right? And she listened. She was cool, and I would kind of quiz her back. I'd show it to her, then I'd quiz her back. I said, what did I say? Okay, so what are these two? She'd get it conceptually, right? Now, she's a big science major, right? And then I'd let her ask me something. And at first, she was a little dry because it was a surprise to her. And eventually, it was, do you want to go first, or do you want me to go first, right? Do you want to ask me a question first? Or do you want me to go first? Well, the cool thing was that after about 15 minutes a segment, right, she'd be so tired. And because she thought, real late at night, you don't have a lot of faculties to engage your left brain, right? Because left brain's the first thing that goes to sleep. But I was also engaging her right brain at the time when she was sort of in a twilight. Her left brain's going to sleep and her right brain's waking up. Psychologists think that the right brain never goes to sleep. It's always there. In fact, because it's so pushed aside during the day while left brain takes care of all the logistics of life, the right brain is ready once you get tired, which is why when some of us lay down at night, you get all these ideas because your left brain is long gone and your right brain's like, hey, the universe was telling me this about this thing, We did this for months and years. I'm going to tell you a couple of the lessons I gave her, but one of the cutest things she ever asked me ever was that I forgot what I had told her. I said, it's your turn. And she goes, okay. And now this regiment's been in place, and she's been thinking about this so much that she's ready. She's been thinking about a question all day, maybe all week. And she goes, how do they make factories? I said, what? She goes, well, how do they make factories? Doesn't it take a factory to make a factory? My kid's like 8 years old, about 9 years old, asking me this question. I was like, holy hell, what a great question. And so I started at, mining ore out of the ground and making it metal in forges that aren't using factories. And I got her all the way up to the point where we actually figured out how to make a factory. I took her through the whole cycle, and she completely got it. And it was super cool, right? And I realized at that point I had accidentally gotten into a regiment that, one, got her to bed on time and made it a creative back and forth between the parent and the child. It was really cool, right? And then she's probably around 10 or 11, and I gave her a very important lesson on the board. And what I did was I drew a timeline, drew a line, now is the one side of it, and the arrow's going off the other side. And I said, this is your age right now. I drew a line on one side, put a little circle where the two intersect. I said, that's you right now in bed. And then I started drawing years ahead. I started drawing 13, 16, 18, and 25. And what I ended up telling her was, I said, look, around 13, you're going to get into boys. And I started telling her about how boys aren't very mature. And so I started saying, when you get to this point, you're going to want to know if boys like you. Now, I know this won't make a lot of sense to you right now, but it's going to happen. I said, at some point in your life, you're going to allow a boy to tell you whether or not you're cool or not, whether or not you're a good person or not, whether or not you're worth being with. And what you need to do is make sure you don't allow that to happen, because I said girls mature faster than boys. So last thing you want is an immature boy controlling your thoughts about yourself. But I told her, I said, probably around 13, 14, somewhere in there, you're going to fall in love with the boy, and he's going to break your heart. And it's going to feel horrible. But you just got to know this is something that happens to everyone. Happened to your dad. Happened to almost everyone you know who's an adult around this time. Unfortunately, it is too soon, I think, in my opinion. We try to, the sad thing about girls in this world is that once they start dating, they never stop until they're married. And they don't get enough solo time with themselves to figure out who they are in life. And once you don't know who you are, again, you don't know where you're going if you don't know where you've been. So if you don't pay attention to where you've been, you have no idea where you're going or why, right? I told her about, crossing over the age of 18. And I told her about the ideas of feeling more independent and wanting more control over her life. I told her at 25, I told her at 18 she'd lose basically all the respect for her parents. I said, you're going to think that we don't know anything because you're going to start getting control of your life and you're going to start making really good decisions and things are going to start working out. But there's going to be a lot of things ahead of your life that you won't have experienced yet. And you're not going to be prepared for finding out those answers sometimes. I said, you need to lean on us parents or some adult in your life to figure out what decision to make. I told her at 25, you're probably going to start swinging back and respecting what we have to offer you. But just know it's a normal process. We sort of all go through this process, right? Right away, I'm giving her some expectations about life. And I'm also giving her sort of the happy ending to say, look, you're going to be confused through this era. But we know what you're going through. So if you feel alienated at any point in your future where you don't think your parents are involved with your life, but at a flip of a switch at 9 o'clock at night, you wish we were there, know that we want to be there for you, so you can always pick up the phone and we'll be there. Text us, whatever, we'll be there for you. And this has really worked out for my kid, right? But lo and behold, she's about 13 years old. I'm working middle of the evening, probably 5 o'clock at my company. My employees had already left for the day. And I get this phone call from my daughter. And I'm excited because she called me. I pick up the phone and she's sobbing. And my kid doesn't cry. My kid so didn't cry that the teachers would call me and say, does she ever cry? She hurt herself. She'd sort of look at her pain. She's like, ow, that hurts. But she wouldn't go into a bawling fit. It was interesting. I have no idea why that happened. But she was sobbing on the phone. At first I thought, oh my God, someone's hurt. This is a really deep cry, And a boy had broken her heart. And, when you're young, you don't really tell your parents you're dating, and you're not really dating, but you feel like somebody's your possession for a little while. And the boy, I guess, had kissed her cousin. And so she was devastated. And so I spent the next 30 minutes obviously talking her down, giving her some perspective. And I reminded her of our session that we had, years before. And she was sort of like, yeah, I know you told me this was going to happen. It doesn't make it feel any better, at least in a big way. And I managed to talk her off the ledge of, feeling really sad. And then she sent me the cutest text messages after that, just basically saying, thank you for always being there for me. You always know what to say. And thanks for preparing me. This is a 13-year-old kid talking like an adult, right? Expectations are everything, right? Now, let's say you're hearing what I'm saying and you're thinking, crap, I've made mistakes in this exact area. In fact, I've made mistakes that are even worse than the ones he's talking about. Believe me, I have too. Kids are extremely forgiving. Extremely forgiving. They don't want to be in a conflicted environment for any reason whatsoever. So if there's been any violation of trust or violation of behavior between you and your child, and I'll let you define what violation means, something you didn't want to have happen, you behaved in a bad way, you got angry when you shouldn't have, or you took it over the top. You should have been a little bit angry, but you took it over the top. You had a bad day and you just had no patience for the situation. Instead of allowing that to fester in you and thinking that your kid's not going to forgive you because you have the mindset of an adult that can hold a vendetta, that can hold a grudge, your child can barely do that. Your child doesn't want to do that. In a small town, what you'll learn is it's sort of a sad fact, but it'll help you in a lot of cases, which is that if you had two parents and one parent was always good and in the child's mind, always there for them, always supportive, said all the right things, and you have another parent that is just a child, doesn't know how to raise a kid, never really thinks about raising a kid, just sort of is a bad parent, the kid will always try to repair the relationship with the bad parent, and in doing so, inadvertently sort of ignore the good parent. And it's very frustrating. I've seen this my whole life, where the parent that's got their act together feels slighted because the other parent is doing a bad job, and the kid never wants to have any parent be screwed up. So they're always focusing on the bad parent and always trying to kiss up to the bad parent. And it can get to the point where the good parent barely ever sees their kid, barely ever can get their attention because they're so focused on fixing the bad parent. So you do have to be careful, I think, with that situation. But if you're stuck in it, at least you know kind of what's going on. It's no slight against you. It's just a natural thing of a child not wanting to have a negative moment in their life, right? Any negativity in their life. But I think a lot of times this originates from not having enough time for your kid. You want to give your kid more time. And it's just, life just gets hard sometimes, right? Sometimes you're thinking, well, geez, if I don't work extra hard, or, just could be simply that. If I don't work extra hard, we don't have enough money to keep the family going. But what happens is the parent doesn't want to admit to the child that there's any hardships going on, because they fear that if they give any sort of indication of insecurity to the child, that the child will lose faith in the parent's ability to be a parent. And I think that you underestimate your child if you think that. And believe me, I'm not pointing fingers, man. I've done it myself. And this is where a little communication and maybe a slight behavioral change in you can solve your own problem, and definitely it can really make you proud of your own genetics. Doesn't even matter if your kid's adopted. Kids have this genetic in them as children, as adults, as human beings, I should say, right? If you've ever made a mistake, you can always go back and bring up the mistake to your child and apologize, right? And I've done this, and I'll give you one example. There was a point in my kid's life where my kid was being disrespectful. It's just one of these teenage things. And I think she had crossed the line where I needed to discipline, let's put it that way. And my choice of discipline was to sort of chew out my kid a little bit for her behavior, and do it from a very fair standpoint. But I got what I had done is I had allowed this sort of behavior to exist longer than it should, because I thought maybe it'll work itself out, and it never did. It just got worse. Which is, again, I defied my own raising regiment, which is to give little tiny changes as opposed to big giant changes, right? And so I bawled out my kid, and it must have been for, 15 minutes. And I raised my voice a little too much, and I was a little too hurtful, I think, in what I was saying. And I, looking back, what I said was probably technically fair, but just too abruptly or abrasive in its delivery. And it became this moment between my kid and myself where she resented me for doing that. And she knew it was fair, and she knew it was, she even admitted to other people in the circle, like, I deserved that, but that went too far. And she was absolutely correct. And it wasn't till, probably 3 or 4 years later that the subject came back around. And I was having a late night conversation with my kid, and everything was perfect. And I used that opportunity to say, when I want to tell you, I said, when that argument happened, when I yelled at you, that very specific time, because very few times I ever did this in her entire lifetime, I said, I was wrong. I went too far. And I apologize for doing that to you. There was a better way of doing that to you. You caught me at a bad time. Not your fault. And I just didn't do a good adult job. And my kid, she said to me, she goes, right after I said that, there's like this beat in the script, right? Little pause. And she goes, I love you. And, it's not like she doesn't tell me that every once in a while, but that particular line meant more to me than anything in my entire life. And I had done what was right, which was apologize. I should have done it a long time before that, and probably very soon after I did it. But I had to come to terms with what I did. I sort of was like, I made a mistake, but I'm not sure what mistake I made and how I made it. And so I didn't know how to put it into words. I probably should have spent more time trying to figure out how to put into words. Like I always tell you guys, rehearse what you're going to say, and eventually you'll distill what should be said. And I defied all my own logic, but I eventually made amends. And you could do this with a very small child, So if you need to make a change, if you've got things kind of upside down in your household with your kid, don't worry. The solution is just right around the corner. It's just, this is new. If this is your first time doing this, it's just new. And, you want to, all children are different. Trust me, I get that. I know that some kids would be ungrateful for an apology, even after an apology, right? And that's just going to happen. But I think eventually they will become grateful that you did take that tact. And you don't want to lose your authority as a parent. You don't want to make it seem like, well, from this point on, you can do whatever you want to do because I'm just afraid to discipline you. I'm afraid to raise my voice to you. You don't want to give that vibe. You're the parent. They're the kid. But there's this thing that happened to me when I was a kid that I want to pass on to you because I think some of you probably feel this. And it's when you discipline a kid and you don't give an excuse as to why you're doing it. How many of you have ever been raised with the line, because? Well, why do I have to do that? Because. That's all you have the energy to say is because. Maybe you try to discipline or pass a piece of information on a day where you just don't have any energy, right? I want to beg you never to use that word with your kid. I understand if you have. Because I hated that answer so much as a child. I never did that to my kid, but that's only because it became very apparent to me. I hated that excuse as a kid. I was like, I'm an intelligent child. Tell me why. Give me a motive. Give me a cause and effect model as to, if I do this thing you don't want me to do, this is what's going to happen to me that's bad, that I don't want to have happen to me, right? I will beg you, just tell your kid a reason. Give them a really good reason why they shouldn't do certain things. And the thing that I find in America, and we bitch about on the show all the time, and I talk about it on Deep Thoughts, is that there's this notion of keeping children for as long as they can possibly be children. I hear this bullshit line constantly. There's nothing more untrue and infectiously negative for society than that line from a parent to a child, or a parent to a parent, right? Oh, my kids are growing up too fast these days. Like, okay, well, why don't you do something to stop war in the world, right? Why don't you do something to stop this propaganda that we need to go and bomb people 8,000 miles away because they're going to come get us, right? Really, probably even 15,000 miles away, right? But the first thing you can do to keep your kids really where you want them to be is to stop talking to them like they're babies after they stop being babies. And I will tell you that in my own experience, I think 7 or 8 is pretty much a good time to really cut out all the baby talk, to cut out the fake voices. I would say even earlier than that, but I know some of you are probably terrified of that experience, but I think most of us, I don't know, I think a lot of us think about this and don't do it, especially if you watch this show, but I've dated people in their 40s, late 40s, who had younger kids, 8, 9, 10, and not only did they talk like babies to their children, but they talked to me like they were children, and little baby voices. And, part of it's a natural thing, especially of a mother, to empathetically dial into their child and say, this is what the child understands, so I'm talking in a tone that the child understands. One, it's very important, even if that's true, that when you talk to daddy, all right, you knock that off. I made a mistake once of, I was dating someone that I thought, well, I can say very black and white. There were times when I would talk to this woman and she would have the most beautiful, sultry voice that was sexy and just mature and adult. And then as soon as the subject matter would come around to the child and what she was doing, I got the baby voice again. Because as soon as the child entered her brain, the communication style of talking like a baby started coming out. And I watched a very specific thing that blew my mind, and I hope this is useful to hear. She was being potentially invited to a party. And I watched her take the phone call with the adult on the other side about attending this party. And, hey, maybe we can get together. And I was new, so I was just watching this occur. And I watched her go into baby talk voice because it had to do with spending some time with a child at this party. And she was turned down on the phone. They gave her a little lame excuse why she shouldn't show up to the party. Why it wasn't going to work out, why they weren't going to quite be where she thought she was going to be. The party wasn't going to quite happen, but she got turned down cold on this phone call. And right then and there I thought, yeah, you just talked to an adult like you're a baby. Like a little squeaky voice for one thing, and it's not your real voice. I know what your real voice sounds like. It's sexy and diva and amazing, right? But you turn into this child. And it got to the point when we needed to be intimate together. Sometimes she'd have the voice of an adult woman that I want to be with, and sometimes she would be carrying this JonBenet Ramsey fetish into the bedroom. And I finally told her one day, I said, look, I don't even know how to mention this because I've never had to mention this in my life, but that voice can exist between us as adults. It can't exist. And I said I was riffing my thoughts. I meant what I said, but it was probably the wrong way to say this, but I said, I don't want to feel like a pedophile in my own bedroom. And she couldn't understand that at all. One, she didn't have any conscious awareness that she was flipping her voice back and forth constantly. And of course, I heard that for days and days and months after that you said that I talk like a baby. And I was like, well, you do. You do. I'm really sorry, but you do. And then I started helping to raise this child. And I realized this kid's a prodigy child. This kid is actually super duper right brain and left brain all at the same time. She struggled with school a little bit because she was so right brain, but she was just bored. She was just bored of the math and stuff. She actually did it really well. She knew how to get a straight A in every class. But I started talking to her like an adult. And then I noticed something very interesting. Her mom would come in the room, and she would start talking like a baby too. The kid realized, I have to talk to my mom like a baby because she is a baby, which wasn't true at all. But this weird paradigm of communication started during infancy and wasn't peeling off in the later years. So I would pick up the child from school and bring her home. We would do homework together, and then we'd do a bunch of super creative stuff. I filled this kid with so many art supplies. It was crazy. Hundreds of dollars of art supplies. And we would just draw and make up stories and do all kinds of really cool stuff. And this kid's creativity was off the chain. If I had been remotely this creative as a kid, I would be twice as successful as I am today. And I can only hope this kid does the exact same thing. So that's a little lesson, hopefully, that you can talk to your children like adults. You know, my uncle talked to me like an adult when I was 9. I've talked about it several times on the show. He sat me down at 9 years old and taught me how to draw faces photographically, never questioned my abilities. He said, you can do this. You're related to us. We have this ability in our family. Whether or not that's true or not, I didn't question it. And sure enough, the anxiety that would have prevented me from getting skills wasn't there because I was treated like an adult. And I freaking loved my uncle because he always treated me like an adult. And before the year was out, he was teaching me quantum mechanics, general relativity and quantum mechanics. And I mean, he went after the jugular of quantum mechanics from the very first conversation. He drilled down the most subatomic argument of the quantum mechanics is pioneered in our thought process. Whether it's true or not, whatever, we'll probably deprecate all that science. But in the end, I grew up with a massively scientific mind because of this guy. And when I needed to ingest other paradigms of science, I was already there because I wasn't treated like a freaking child. Now, the other one was I have another kid that I actually actively mentor to this day. And she's a super duper prodigy child. She's about 5 years older than the other kid. And she's about 13 today. And, I do these shows, right? And they're deep and they go for hours and we talk. And there's going to be 100 of these before too long, right? This 13-year-old kid. In fact, last time I talked to her at depth was when she was just on her precipice of her 13th birthday. So she's 12 years old. I talked to this kid, I kid you not, for 4.5 hours. And I felt like I was talking to an adult. And this kid was so open-minded and so cross-referencing and so dialed into society. And she actually told me, she said, she helped me mentor the other kid that I was actually living with at the time. But she said to me, the 13-year-old or 12-year-old, whatever, she said to me, when I hang out with my friends, I have to pretend to be dumb so I can have a good time with them. And I thought first my heart broke. I was like, oh my God, there's no way around that. But she was also and is a sweet, understanding person. So she understands the paradigm that she's in. She understands what needs to happen to do what she does, and she's academically just screaming through school. She taught herself how to play the piano. She taught herself how to sing and dance. So she does all these crazy theatrical performances and just blows away all the other kids at these talent contests. And she's just literally a breath of fresh air, right? She would technically be probably considered whatever they're going to call the children of millennials. This was what this kid is, right? I think what's sad is all these Gen X labels and baby boomer labels, they're too wide. They're too much. Like they're too many decades in these eras that they try to put us all into demographically, and so they're inaccurate to quite a degree, right? The hipster demographic is too big. It's too many age brackets in there, and too many of us are lumped into the Gen X thing. So it's a little bit hard to have these conversations, but I think you know where I'm going with this. But I think that if you think about where you want your child to be in the end, right, when they go autopilot and they leave the house, maybe get through college and they go autopilot, where you don't want them calling you for $1 every single time they got to pay a bill, and you don't want them to be emotionally devastated by life, whether it be the challenges of existing in this world or having a relationship with someone. That's when I think you'll rethink this idea of keeping kids forever. Because if you think about that philosophy for just 1 second, what are we really talking about here? We're talking about keeping children, because a child is unequipped to deal with life. That's what a child is. That's why we have that label on a child, right? And so when you butt that up against adulthood, where there's supposed to be there's no pre-adolescent stage anymore. It's baby, adult, with these people that think that should be the way that they raise their kids. It's really putting your kid in utter jeopardy, and it's also jeopardizing your future as a parent, because you won't be able to go off and become the other thing that you can become after you raise your children, because you're going to constantly be in this baby talk mode with your kids, because that's what they have been raised to be. And I think that most of us can agree that we want our children to be, one, smarter than we are, more accomplished than we are, and we're never in competition with our kids. We push them up. As I told my daughter, I said, look, if my goal in life is to push you as high as I possibly can push you, so that the heel of your foot is at the top of my fingertips, and if I can push you as high as I possibly can, and then I croak right after I push you as high as I possibly can, then I have lived a perfect life as your parent. That you can take everything that I have, stand on my shoulders, stand on my fingertips, and I can get you up there. I've done my job. And there's no way that I think I can accomplish that if I were to let my kid be a baby, be a child for the rest of her life, So we talk about rite of passage on the show every once in a while, right? A rite of passage is way more than a metaphorical concept. It is a necessity of humanity. As a child gets older, that they want to start making decisions for their life, because one, they don't want to be told what to do constantly. That is the beautiful freedom inside of humanity that keeps pushing out. And, we talk about gun ownership in America and how important that is, and that is just an extension of what an adult wants as freedom. It's protection against someone coming in and draconianly telling you what you have to do, right? In America, we have existence tax now. Most countries do. It's unthinkable. It's Orwellian. It's been prophesized by our greatest minds that the governments want to completely control you. And it's really the people above them and above them, right? So you have to facilitate, I think, quite consciously, a rite of passage within your child, whereby you give them the authority to become the adult that they want to be. And it's going to be a pre-adolescent construct in your child, right? They're not going to really be equipped for everything, but at least you will have handed the baton off to your child at a point where they get to be empowered a little bit more and a little bit more, right? I got my rite of passage in a really weird way. and I've said it on the show a long time ago. I don't know if I've said it in Deep Thoughts. I think I did say it in Deep Thoughts a long time ago. Since there's so many episodes and we're on the subject, let's recap here. I lived in Massachusetts for a couple of years, 2.5 years, and I moved back to Kansas when I was 13. And I remember the day where we had come back, and my grandmother had worked out a house we could buy by having a family friend in our small little town who wanted to move to a different town. To a different facility. I think they were going to get into some assisted living. And so we got their house, and their family friends, and it was cool. And on that day, we were moving all of our stuff into the house, and it was all these truck trips from this warehouse into the house. Okay. One of the trips, my dad was driving the truck, and it's back in the 80s when you could ride in the back of a pickup truck in a small little town. The speed limit's 30. And my dad's Army buddy, the guy I've talked about a couple times, who was just Vietnam vet, ex-helicopter pilot, seen everything and done everything, right? A guy I respect tremendously. My dad's one of my dad's best friends in the whole world. And I don't know why we got in this conversation, but he started talking to me. He'd known me for 2.5 years because he was in Massachusetts when we lived there. And I don't know why the hell he was in our little town. He had to have flown 1,500 miles to help us with this move, but I think maybe he was moving too. I can't remember. We're in the back of this pickup truck, and he says to me, I think you're more mature than your father. I was like, whoa. Well, I'm 13. And he said, I think at this point you need to start raising yourself. You've heard me say this a lot. I told my daughter this, and I've said this a couple times. But in saying that to me, in a very humble voice, and I was a humble kid to begin with, so I wasn't going to take this and run with it and go crazy. He changed my perspective of my entire life. And one, I had dealt with issues where I thought I was more mature than my dad at certain times. And it's not that I had more wisdom and life experience to deal with life. My father obviously had lived way more life than me, 25 years more than I had, or 23 years more than I have. And so it wasn't that. It was just that I needed to start making decisions for myself and owning my existence. And coming from such a father goose character in my life, a very well-respected person, I thought, well, wow, this is something I'm going to do. And in that year, I lied on a job application and got a job working in the movie theater downtown, right? At 13, I think I turned 14 within a few months of lying on this application, which is funny when I get the statement from the Social Security office about all the money I've made in my lifetime. I'm illegally collecting money at 13, which is funny. But I not only worked for the movie theater, but I opened it. I sold the tickets. I called the tickets into the movie, the movie agency where you told how many tickets you bought. I set up the concession. I threaded the projectors. I helped clean up. I helped shut the place down. I think the only thing I didn't have to do was actually lock the place up at night. But I could unlock it in the morning and get it all running in the early afternoon, right? And I think I was able to do that because I didn't perceive myself as a child anymore. And the euphoric nature of taking control of my life and earning money was gigantic. I had my own money at 13, 14 years old. Consequently, in the Midwest, you can drive at 14 as well. So I got a car that I could drive on my little permit. And my friends who were 13 and 12 were riding in the car with me. And we used to make money breakdancing, if you can believe that. Just make about $100 a week doing that too. Always an entrepreneur, let me tell you. But that is something I think as parents we have to do. We have to figure out a good time where we can start to say, and not as a consequence of existence, but as a rite of passage. And what do I mean by that? A consequence of existence would be you're old enough to take care of yourself, so start taking care of yourself. That's a consequence of existence. That's a challenging situation that makes the child want to crawl back up into the womb, right? But if you say to your child something like, I think you're a really neat kid, and I've been watching you your whole life, and I have to say, I'm really proud of you. And this is maybe even if you're not quite completely sure that your child's ready for this, you tend to scale to the occasion, right? Like I love the movie Unbreakable. Sorry, I had to look that up. Unbreakable is a movie about Bruce Willis, who's sort of a superhero, that he gains his power to the extent he is challenged. And he always survives all these catastrophic accidents. But we always say that phrase, catchphrase, scale, I always rise to the occasion, And your children will rise to the occasion when given this coveted opportunity to become an adult. In what we would call primitive cultures, they actually have rites of passage that are very physical. In tribes in Africa, there's these, in South America too, they take these bullet ants, which if you haven't seen, they're like 1-inch ants, and when they sting you, they say it feels like a bullet hitting your body. And they make these, they take these leaves, these tropical leaves, and they punch the stinging butts of these bullet ants all throughout these leaves, and they create a sandwich, like a glove. And they weave them together, and the kid has got to put their hand in this thing, almost like the little scene in Dune, and they have to get bit. And they can't express any pain. They can't whimper. Otherwise, they have to wait 1 year to do it again. And it's funny, we've had all these, jackass guys go around and do it, and they just simply couldn't handle it because it was so utterly painful. And again, they don't feel the need to have a rite of passage, so they can pull their hand out and whimper on camera to make a joke for us. But the kids that are doing it are very, very serious because they want that rite of passage. There's one of my favorite movies that's a comedy is Ace Ventura 2, and he gets to this African tribe, and there's a guy standing on a pole and trying to balance on one leg. And he's got to do it for a really long time, and then he gets his rite of passage. And, Ace Ventura went up and took the pole and shook it, and he says, with my help, you'll be the best there ever was, something like that. He'll be the best he can be, and he's spitting spitballs at his face while he's up there. But these rites of passage are huge for these, again, primitive cultures. But I wouldn't pat ourselves too much on the back because I think we've lost that rite of passage, which is this chain of command, this baton that's that's handed off to our children to become adults, to formalize the pre-adolescent stage to adulthood. I think the consequence if we don't do this correctly and formalize it is that our children go off and become sort of chaotic, fearful creatures of the universe, because at no point did someone say it's your turn to become an adult. The son that's trying to grow the mustache and barely has enough hair follicles to make a shadow underneath his nose, he's ready. He is ready to go to that next stage. The time the kid starts trying to shave, all of us kids cut the crap out of our faces. We had no whiskers, and we're trying to use razor blades on our face. Of course, we're going sideways and cutting up ourselves. But we're trying to be adults. Again, if your child doesn't ebb towards that naturally, there's probably potentially some over-coddling that's going on, some codependency that's happening, or maybe they're just sort of a soft soul, and they're sort of afraid, which is where affirmations come in, right? I bumped into some really weird scenarios in my lifetime. One of my friends in the Bay Area, a woman, she told me once her mother was a nun in a convent, and her father was a Marine. And somehow they got together and had kids, lots of them. And she had an issue with guys. She was really sort of loose with herself and would just throw herself. Beautiful woman, but she was unfortunately used food as a creature comfort, right? And got herself a little overweight. So she was never revered as the beautiful woman that she was, because she just sort of mismanaged her life due to probably some upbringing issues, right? But we got in this conversation one night, and she said, no one in my household ever says I love you. Not to each other, not my parents to each other, not the parents to the kids. And I'm thinking, well, okay, if there's a war-torn Marine, and this was in the, her father would have been a Marine in the 80s with no war in America, so he wasn't coming down with PTSD or anything like that. Desert Storm would have been the only thing he would have remotely interacted with, and I think he was done with his entire service. I don't think he was a Vietnam vet. But imagine that, a nun. As a mother, you would think a nun would be so in tune with love and God and country that this would be something that would be said, but it wasn't said. And the kid, Howard Stern for years used to bring every female on his show that was a porn star or who had a lot of, I guess you would, in the traditional morality of the universe would be a sexual deviant, right? Got into something oversexed and sort of made themselves an object of men. And Howard would always ask that question. What are your problems with your daddy? And I don't know if they fed into it because it was a scripted show, but it was unanimous. Every woman gave a huge story about how their father left them or how their father beat them up or whatever. There's always some weird thing with their dad. And they flipped the script such that having sex with men was a sense of being approved by men. You know, this is something for your daughters, of course. I think men have their own insecurities. I think especially with the internet, you know, with the internet, it sort of makes all of us feel inadequate with everything in life. You think you're a painter. Well, you can search on the internet in 10 seconds. You're finding 1,000 people that are 100 times better than you at painting, and they're just effortlessly doing it in your mind, right? They never practiced or anything. They just know how to do it. Okay. You know, I was very, very fortunate, and I didn't realize it, that everywhere I went, my family was very huggy and lovey. Not overly hovey and luggy, but luggy is a new word for you, lovey. But they, you know, I came to California with this sense of confidence and upbringing that I had, one, raised myself to be as smart as I possibly could be. So I got to California at 18. I was a professional software engineer and artist, right? And as I grew up and had to do this to my own kid, I split it into two categories. One, I went to psychology twice at college, and I've told this story before, but there's the horrific story about where they did this experiment in a maternity ward where all the babies are put, you know, after they're born. And I don't know where the hell this happened now that I think about it, but they didn't hug any of the babies. They fed them, but they didn't hug them. And all of a sudden, all the babies started dying in this room, and a horrendous amount of children died. I think more than 24 babies started to die. They started dying in their little incubation things, and the nurses started rushing in and holding the children constantly, and the children still passed away. It was as if the consciousness of these beings said, I'm in the wrong world. I'm in a loveless world, and I need to get out of here. And these kids just started passing away. It was weird. Maybe something else occurred that they're not telling us, but that's how the official story is taught in college. And I had heard the story twice, you know. So being brought up with that horror story, I thought, well, you know, my kid's going to get plenty of hugs, you know, and I'm just a lovey dad anyway. But I split it up into two different things. There was always plenty of affirmation, hugs and kisses and all that kind of stuff. Definitely a nightly ritual with my kid where I'd play with her, you know, in her crib, and we used to do little, you know, goofy little things to get her to laugh her heart out until she fell asleep. And then as she got older, I made a second regimen of sort of an adult level of approval if she really did something great. And I would tell her what she did that made me feel great about her. And so all throughout her life and this certain heartbeat of existence, I just said, you know, that was great. You are a great kid. You know, if she helped her friend or something at school, or she felt compassion for someone's situation in school, it was a great thing. She was empathetic towards other human beings, and it wasn't like I sat her down and go, you should feel empathy for other people. She just was that kind of person, and still is to this day, right? But it would, you know, when I grew up, me giving that advice to anybody when in the 70s, they look at me like, duh, of course you would do that to your kids. But I think that as we've allowed society to erode, we are so busy just surviving, and it's through no fault of anyone, right? I mean, it's a fault of, I guess everyone has allowed the world to turn to shit, and everybody who denies reality contributes to this problem moving forward. But we're just caught up in reality as parents, right? And it kicks our ass every once in a while. So one of the pieces of advice I gave in the essay that I got a great feedback on, and a parent tried this and it really, really works. So I want to make sure I close up with this, is that, you know, one of the pieces of feedback I got from the show, from the essay, was that the whole idea of apologizing to your kid if things have gotten a little sterile at home. You've been out of their view. You've been out of that huggy circuit, that regiment. And what I said was, why don't you pick a day of the week? And this is going to sound stupid to some of you, but some of you are going to go, oh yeah, I can do that. And I certainly was this guy. You need to schedule a night with your family. And I don't care if you're a single dad or a single mom, or you have the perfect nuclear family. and I think most families have something like this, but I think there should be a reliable time, and it's going to fade away as your kids get older. They're going to want to spend time with their friends and not with you, right? You got to just understand that that's your genetics taking over, man. That's the rite of passage occurring right before your very face, right? And you should be proud that your kid is taking that level of independence, and of course, if you raise them to sort of mitigate the world and what is good and what is bad, they'll tend to pick good friends. They'll tend to purge bad friends. They might have a friend that's good, then they get into drugs, and they turn into a weirdo. When I was a kid, there was a lot of kids that got into crime as a way to get off because it was an adrenaline dump, a dopamine dump when they succeeded, and that became an issue. But scheduling a day with your family where it's like, this is pizza night, this is movie night, and maybe just ask the kids what they want to do. Maybe they want to go out and play catch, whatever the hell it is that you guys do, because every family's different, every kid's different. But making sure that there's time to be together, The other one that I've seen that can interrupt that, which you don't need to worry about too much, is I've seen kids get involved with their own projects very, very early. And the parents short-circuit it because they feel like there's the family time's disappearing to it. And I want to explain that. I've seen a kid that got into writing, and she got her first computer. She started writing, and she wanted to be in her room using her computer writing stories. I mean, the kid was like 13, 14 years old. And so you're like, wow, this is amazing. And I had the privilege of reading these stories, and I was like, man, this kid is on to something. I'm a writer, and this kid's just pulling them out of her hat. But the parental factor in her house said, thought it was inappropriate for her to sit in her room and ignore the rest of the family while they were having maybe a random family night, right? By not setting a regimented family night, the family night would always override and randomly happen over her creativity time. So instead of regimenting this so the kids can have a time to have to themselves, or even explain to the parents that they have this, the kid was short-circuited and never wrote again. And I think that was heresy from the parent down to the child. So understand that if your kid does build up a talent, that you're going to need to make room as a parent and hopefully encourage and enable that talent to happen, Now, let's say a couple things about your kids getting into things. One from my personal experience, actually two from my personal experience, one I figured out sort of serendipitously. I find that if you give a kid a bunch of tools to do something and you suggest that the child actually does something with those tools, the kid will feel like it's a pattern that is not unique to them, and they'll tend to steer away from it. What do I mean? Well, if you get a kid a bunch of art supplies and you say, you should be an artist, man, you're really good, blah, 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 or you did something on your own, now I'm going to give you all this stuff, and I want you to do more stuff with the stuff I got you. A lot of times kids will rebel. And they won't rebel vocally or anything, but they simply won't use it. Because it's sort of like, well, it's dad giving me this stuff, and but I'll tell you the trick. The trick I found is you buy all this stuff and you leave it around the house. You leave it in plain sight. In fact, you maybe make it something they can't, in their own mind, you don't say that they can use it. And then they start using it. They start using it because it's a little secret thing that they're doing, right? My dad bought a computer once, and I was already into computers in my school. So I had snuck off and started doing this at school, learning how to program. And then when a computer came into the household, I was like, damn, let me get on this thing. And eventually my dad got my own computer. But I started programming like crazy. And a weird thing occurred. I want to make sure that you guys don't fall into this mistake. And if you're looking at the playhead, we're almost done here. My dad, I can only say, he's still alive and stuff. Great guy. But he struggled as a young man being in competition with me. It's the weirdest thing. I've seen this happen a lot in life in general. It doesn't happen a lot, I should say, in percentage-wise, but it does happen. I've had friends of mine that tell me about their stories with this. But I became very quickly a programmer much more intense than my father. It wasn't his bag. He wasn't trying to be a big coder. He did want to learn how to do it, but I would sit there at his work and I'd program crazy stuff and be complete, be done with my project, and it would do all this crazy stuff. And I think at that point, he saw that as competition. And so he would start to sabotage everything that I did. It was a weird thing. One, he wouldn't let me go to his work anymore. would let me get access to the computer. Wanted me off his machine. Got me a much slower, tinier machine for me to program, although I own that bitch, right? And then in my my high school days, as my little entrepreneurial gene kept going, I got into video. My dad bought a video camera, and we had always had tons of VCRs and stuff. And so I would, he started editing together weddings. He's a wedding photographer on the side and would do videos. When video became part of the commodity, you had to sell to the bride and groom. And so I saw him set up 2 VCRs, and he pushed 2 tapes in and get them synced up so that they were in the right SMPTE code to each other, just by random pausing and stuff. And then he'd run a master splitter out to a 3rd VCR, which he could push record on. And so he would take this switch. He had 2 TVs, and he would take the switch and flip it back and forth between the shot that he thought was better, like a little editing bay, right? Before we actually had professional editing bays at our house through Final Cut, right? So I watched him do this, and I was like, that's ingenious. My father's a brilliant man, right? And so I started filming videos in my hometown to make money. My hometown had this thing where these daughter mothers would get in these contests that would happen in like Florida, and so they'd fly down. They had to bring this little press kit with them, and there'd be a competition of who's the best daughter mother. Things were really weird, but you always had to bring 2 videos. One was sort of an upbeat song where they're having a lot of fun, and one was sort of a touching song where they would have sort of a very bonding moment together as mother-daughter. And so I would make these videos, and I would make moms cry like crazy, man. I picked these really heart-wrenching songs, and I'd edit it was almost like an autopilot, right? They were thinking things that happened between them. It was always deeper for them. But, every parent wants to be close to their child, and I was capturing this in video. And so I got really good at this editing thing. And then I got to high school, and we had our own TV channel called PCTV, which is like Public Communications Television or something like that. And it would broadcast on television. So we would make a bunch of stuff in class and broadcast it out. Well, I tried to get in this class because I was already making money on the side. I was a professional at this, quite frankly. And the teacher had to approve your application for the class. And this teacher and I are best friends to this day. But she didn't pick me for the class, and I can't figure out why. But one of the kids in school was a great guy. His father was one of the teachers of the gifted kids, and so of course this gifted kid gets in there because he was only in the gifted class because his father taught the class, not because he was a mega genius or anything. Again, he's a great guy. No slight against him. But he eventually got, what happened was 2 things. He started getting tired of the class. He just couldn't give a shit about it. He was in a bunch of sports and a bunch of other things. He had so much stuff on his plate. And I was starting to make all the videos for the kids who were in the class because they didn't know how to do it. So they couldn't even go, Mark, help me out, man. I got to do this. And so I'd write a script, and we'd go out and film, and then I'd come back and edit it together. And we made this crazy comedy called Super Nerd. We had these dentures that one of my friend's mothers had made. It fit this one kid in school. And so we put these mega dentures in, so these really incredible buck teeth, and we created this little script where it was like the Hulk, where this nerd would get beat up, and then he'd flip, and he'd be the super nerd, and he'd kick everybody's ass. And we mixed in every crazy, awesome song from Sig Zig Sputnik's music to Houdini to Run DMC and Aerosmith, and just made these hilarious things. The kid was doing all this lewd shit in the video. It was great. And so after that started occurring, I got elected into the class once the kid left, right? Well, then I rise to the top, and I'm hosting the show, and I'm making all this crazy stuff, helping all the kids out. I make music videos, right? I don't even tell you how I made them, but I made a few things that I was really proud of. And I had this Super Nerd video that went all around the town, man. I mean, they would play this in class, and I'd walk by a class, and I'll be dying laughing. I'd look in, and there must be my video being played at a different class. It was funny. And so I told my dad, I said, look, this is my tapes. Here's the money for the tapes, right? For the video camera tapes, right? And they're little tiny video camera tapes, right? They're not ones that you record anything on besides what's through the camera, right? And I punched out the little nub in the side of the cassette so no one could push record on the tape. These are done. These are principal footage, master tapes. And I came home one day, and, I'd bought these from my father. I told him, don't record over this shit. I'm punching the thing out. Don't mess it up. He recorded over my master footage. Just a spiteful thing as a parent who was in competition with me. Really, really weird. And that was just one example of all the spiteful shit that happened, right? I've had some of my most photorealistic sketches destroyed by my dad. He just couldn't fucking handle the difference between our talents, and he wanted to be me. I guess that was the thing. He's all better now, right? But he really struggled in his, I guess it was his late 30s, early 40s with the kid that was like me. Instead of viewing it as the ultimate accomplishment of being a great parent, of enabling me with tools and teaching me things, right? And I just want to make sure that I want to mention that because it's a weird one. But if any of you are suffering from that, you need to flip the script, right? And I'll finish with this. Now, I moved to LA when I was 17, turned 18 a couple weeks later. And I, like I said, I immediately got into writing. I started writing novels right away, and then I started getting into screenwriting. When I learned that Steven Spielberg and George Lucas had the same sort of father, that their fathers, instead of being like my dad and recording over all my master footage and destroying the evidence of my past accomplishments, that they actually enabled their sons with more video cameras, Super 8s, and helped them make special effects. If any of you have seen the first, I think, war movie that I think Spielberg filmed as a kid at 13 years old, 12 or 13, their father was out there getting all the kids loaded up with army helmets and fake guns, and they took, to make mortar shells look like they hit the ground, they put a plank of wood underneath the ground with a bunch of dirt on one end, and the kids knew that to make it look like they'd been hit by a mortar, they would run and then they would sort of jump on the plank and throw the dirt in the air, and then they'd fall on the ground. Into the camera, filmed from a certain angle, looked like they got hit by a mortar. So Spielberg got to start his life, and Lucas got to start their life and get into film school because they had this portfolio from the age of 13 to 18. And when I learned that that's the way their fathers behaved, and that's why they got the opportunities that they got, I was furious that I had the same exact, in fact, I wrote the scripts, and they were very engaging scripts. They made you cry or they made you laugh. I had all those accolades, but they were erased by 18. Had I had all those videotapes available to me when I was 18, and I met a bunch of people that were writing the movies that I was watching, they were in the church that I was in, right? I mean, like Edward Scissorhands, sort of like high-level stuff. If I had said, look, I got this portfolio of stuff, can you get me into these individuals? They would have had the material to say, look at this prodigy kid. We got to get him into film school. Got to get him a scholarship, find the money for him. Well, I probably could have found the money. But I lost all those accolades to be able to pitch myself. So I stuck with what I was really good at, which was software engineering, architecture, and drawing video games, right? Which led to a whole nother life that was great. But I missed out on a whole opportunity, and now I'm fighting at 46 to get into the industry as a writer. But I probably would have jumped, and I was a good-looking guy, so I probably could have got in front of the camera if I wanted to. But regardless, I was mature, I could have a conversation with an adult, and I lost that opportunity. So I want to make sure that as a parent, if you find yourself in that realm, stop doing it immediately. All right. You could, what's funny is my father always said to me, when you get rich, you're going to buy me a car, you're going to buy me a house, you're going to take care of me. I'm like, okay, dude. Well, if you hadn't fucked up my entire childhood and erased it, then I would have been able to provide this stuff for you. You would have gone down the red carpet perhaps, right? But because you spited me, now I'm behind in one way or another, right? It's not a guarantee that anything's going to work out. Now, if you're not doing this and you have the opportunity to be like those other fathers, to support your kids in what they like to do, and a lot of you already do this, and hats off to you, man. Again, if any of this is what you already do, then just pat yourself on the back. This is a huge affirmation of what you've done already, right? If you're pre-kids, hey, man, this is going to set you up for life, But make sure you get behind your kids and support them, even if you don't understand it. Your kid wants to be a stand-up comedian, and you think that industry's dead. Support them, because you'll help them figure it out faster anyway, right? There's so many parents in my age bracket of 40 that are having their rent paid for by their parents because they've turned out to be nothing. They never supported their kids, or maybe they did and their kids just became lazy. Maybe they were over-coddled. Maybe they had too much money. Maybe they've always been written a check. So there's no mother of invention, right? It's okay for your kids to be raised exactly the way you were raised if you like the way you were raised. One of the biggest things that we do is we say we're going to change the way we raise our kids, but their kids are going to be totally compatible with us. That doesn't work. Now, sometimes you live in abused environments, right? And you want to take away the abuse. Well, no one's going to argue with that, right? But you do need to understand, even if you take out the abuse factor that you were raised with, what's probably going to happen is that you're not compatible with your kid. It's not a bad thing, but it's something you have to deal with to say, look, I was raised really, really rough. How many people have you heard that you're heroes in whatever industry that you're, if sports or whatever you're into, and they said, man, my family was completely broke, and I rose up through that hardship, and I became something great because it was the mother of invention that allowed me to be that way. But the over-coddling thing makes a bunch of kids that are not only incompatible with you as a parent, but they're unmanageable as a kid and as an adult. I think we have plenty of archetypes, stories that we've heard from other people that we don't have to oversupply our kids with things, and just because all the other kids are doing it, well, you just explain to your kid, look, the kids that get everything turn into nothing half the time, probably more than half the time. And I want you to turn into something because I love you, and you need to see it like that. Because, you can just explain it to them. Look, if I give you all this stuff for free, when will you ever earn $1 of your own? That's the end of this episode. But that's sort of my take on raising kids that I think has a lot of wisdom that I just gained from other people. Very few things I talked about in this video are my inventions, right? And I don't even care. I'm not here to get an accolade from anybody. We have to raise this next generation to really have their act together because they're going to run the world, And if this stuff works for you, please do what you can to pass it to other people, Obviously be careful because people don't want to be told how to raise kids half the time. And again, those are the people usually in the most need. But, you do have people that are running around telling you put your kids on vaccinations, and they're the people you don't listen to. But I think we're all hip to that, right? So if you made it this far, super duper reward for you, an accolade, and I appreciate you listening this far. I think we're all on the same page. We want the world to be a better place. I always say that. And I think we're doing it. I honestly think we're doing it. There's a lot of negative forces against us, but you're going to have to probably educate your kid because the schools aren't doing it. If you can homeschool, I used to think that was a horrible idea. One, you got to make sure you got some information to share with your kids. But if nothing else, make sure they have reading, writing, and arithmetic in their brain. Make sure they understand the compound interest of a credit card because it's never taught anywhere. You just become a serf to it. And we got to stop that as well. So again, if you made it this far, thanks for listening. MKUltraRadio.com for all the feeds. Our normal show's back on. The normal show is way different than this show, as you guys can tell. Kyle and I are different human beings. We have different views on things. So if you dig the deep thoughts and you go to the normal show and you're horrified, I understand. I completely understand. You can just tune into deep thoughts and ignore the normal show if it doesn't fit your mindset. We're trying to do something very, very different on this show. It's very, very subatomic to the human consciousness. And so, I think it's good to hear all sides of things, and nothing else we can learn by our disagreements as much as our agreements, right? But take care of yourself. Take care of your little ones. If you're going to have some kids, hopefully put some of this to good thought. If you made any mistakes, just say you're sorry and have a good night with the family. If your kids are grown and out of the house and you think you need to have some repair going on, make some phone calls, make some visits. Just be honest. As you would tell me, oh, God, I screwed this up with my kid. I don't think they're going to understand. Use those words with them because it probably works just fine. Anyway, I'll see you in the next Deep Thoughts. Over now, folks.